Right. Okay. Spread out.
All set?
Okay, we're on the record.
Okay. Good evening, everyone, and welcome to the April 29th, 2019 regular meeting of the Township of Montclair Planning Board. In accordance with New Jersey statute, adequate notice of this meeting has been provided by posting a copy of the notice on the first floor of the municipal building and by sending a copy to the local paper. This meeting is being broadcast live on Channel 34 and is streaming live and will be available on demand at montclairnjusa.org. This meeting is a quasi-judicial proceeding, meaning we have powers and procedures resembling a court of law, and we are obligated to objectively determine facts and draw conclusions from them in order to provide the basis of an official action. Any question or comments must be limited to the issues of what the board may legally consider in reaching a decision, and the decorum appropriate to a judicial hearing must be maintained at all times. Please be advised that this is a no-smoking facility. Fire exits are to my right or your left, and in the back of the room where you entered. First up is roll call.
Chair Nguyen is excused. Vice Chair Brodock.
Here.
Mr. Schwartz.
Here.
Mr. Cook.
Here.
Counselor Schlager.
Here.
Ms. Willis.
Here.
Mr. Rooney is excused. Mr. Ian Wally.
Here.
Ms. Lockman. Here. Mr. Barr. Mr. Gilmer.
Here.
Okay.
Next up, we have approval of the minutes from the March 25th, 2019 meeting.
Are there any changes to the March 25th minutes? Is there a motion to approve? Second?
Second.
All in favor?
Aye.
Aye.
Opposed? Abstentions?
Abstain.
Okay.
Next up is resolution for application 2611, Celine Choice, 5 Pierpont Drive.
Did you get the comments, the changes? Yeah.
I did.
So we received changes from Ms. Lockman. Do you have any comments on her edits?
No, other than to thank you.
Are there any other changes to the resolution? Motion to approve? Second?
Second.
All in favor?
Aye.
Aye.
I'm not sure I was here for this.
You might not
That-
have been.
That would have been,
All right.
okay.
I'm mixing, it's too much business. I can't keep track. Okay.
So,
Okay, no, anybody opposed? Abstentions?
abstain.
Okay.
Okay, on to committee reports. We have a report from the Master Plan Subcommittee on the Montclair Safe Complete Streets Implementation Plan.
So before we get into the details on the report from the subcommittee, I just want to take a step back about what this document is. As you on the planning board, most of you, I mean, Mr. Cook was not part of that discussion, but most of you recall about a year ago, we had a presentation on the draft plan from the various members of the steering committee who were involved. It was spearheaded by the township engineer who got a DOT grant for the township to oversee the preparation of this complete streets implementation plan. The concept was the township's adopted, was one of the first municipalities to adopt a complete streets policy, but has been somewhat slow in implementing it in some of the street projects in the township. So the idea was to prepare a plan to provide guidance on how our streets could be improved to actually implement the complete streets policy. So after, I think we had about a year's worth of meetings, the focus was to create a policy document that did not have concrete proposals for specific streets, but created a process and a framework for evaluating we do prioritize which streets need to be considered complete streets with a need for bike improvements, and that's on the map that's in the plan. But there's a variety of options to consider to make them complete. And the idea was to reach out to the neighborhoods and the people who live along those streets when those streets are being improved and bring them into the process so that it would be truly a locally driven decision-making process. And this provides the framework. So the request last year was, should this be adopted as an element of the master plan? Because that was really the way it was crafted. And the response was the members of the planning board did not feel comfortable with it as it was written. We've since, at the request of the Pedestrian Safety Advisory Committee, who was pushing for this adoption, the subcommittee was looking at it to see what exactly were they uncomfortable with and what could be done to make this a document that perhaps the planning board could support. So that's where we are tonight, and the subcommittee has met twice now to discuss it, and they're all here if they want to discuss their recommendations.
Who could you, I forgot who's on the subcommittee from the board?
Daniel, Carol, and Carmel.
Oh, okay, thank you.
So I don't know who wants to take the lead in the discussion.
I have a question. What is the notification? You mentioned that when improvements are made to an area, is the same notification that would extend to a development project or a site plan?
Well, we haven't even decided that we would agree that the process should continue with any kind of notification or modification.
So take everything I said and put if in front.
So there is, obviously, when streets are repaved or resurfaced, they're really, as far as I understand, the Department of Community Services does not reach out to the neighborhood to determine how it should be designed. I know Kim Kraft would occasionally do public outreach meetings to help dictate certain street segments. The idea here is that to make it a more interactive when you're going to improve a street, if it's one of the streets that are identified in here as a street for potential bike improvements, and look at the pedestrian improvements as well, such as bump outs. Anyway, to look at those streets and look at the options in here and reach out to the community and bring them in the
Yeah,
process.
my only question is real simple. Are we going to notify the people that stuff is going on in the street, or just like have an article in the paper or whatever? So now if you live within 200 feet of an application, you have notification. So my question is, you just talked about everyone's going to get involved. My only question is how do they get involved?
They would have to reach out to
Be
them,
aware?
probably send out flyers to the people who live there in that community and say,
Well, I'm just asking.
come to a meeting.
But I don't think there's this, I'm going to jump in and say, I don't think there is a defined process,
Okay.
Tony. I think it's probably incumbent upon community services, perhaps the township council may want to get involved for their constituents, but I don't think there's a dictated process. I know when my street was repaved a couple of years ago, it was around the time there were a lot of streets being repaved, so I think...
I'm not repaving, I just like if you take parking away, if you do other stuff.
But that's what we're going to decide here, whether that's a viable process that should be implemented, and or how it should be implemented. In
And
other words,
just-
the fundamental report itself addresses a certain process and procedure going forward, and we're going to discuss now whether we think that's right or wrong or in between. Right? You see what I mean?
Yeah.
How that then gets communicated after is to be determined. Right now, as others said, there's no process for telling people that the street is about to be dealt with other than some kind of notification, like when a street is paved. It's the underlying policy, whether there should be bike modifications, pedestrian modifications, that we're going to address.
Okay, I have a complete disconnect about notification on all this. I live next to a street that would, I'll just be quiet for a while.
So, yeah, so just,
I thought, because this is all good stuff. I didn't think that we had the capacity to discuss it, but let's talk about it. That's fine.
yeah, so that's a little of what occurred when we met as a subcommittee. And so just to get into the report that came out of that time, during our discussion, we were initially weighing whether we felt that this should be adopted or amended to the master plan, and we agreed as a subcommittee, as it stands now, that would not be the best way for us to recommend we proceed. So we then looked at the plan and figured out, okay, so what from the items in this document might we be able to support? And so that's really what you see listed out here. And so first off, focusing on the pedestrian improvements, we said, okay, we agree with those. And then secondly, so I'll just say the first two that we pretty much agree with across the whole town, is whenever there's resurfacing, so that's item 2, having sharrows, as illustrated in the image in the report, put onto the street. Again, this would have no impact to the flow of vehicles or any of the infrastructure. It's just simply reinforcing a message that's already true throughout the whole town, in that the street is shared between cars and bikes. And then getting to your point, when we get to item 3, speaking to dedicated bike lanes that may lead to a reduction in parking, we probably need to discuss more as a planning board what we really mean by community outreach being required and engagement. And then the fourth piece is around the subcommittee recommending certain streets to be prioritized rather than supporting all of the changes to the map, which I think is
Page 14.
on page
Yeah.
14. So we just highlighted certain streets on page 14 that we thought would be best to prioritize for review when there is resurfacing of the streets. But again, I just don't want people to misinterpret this as a comprehensive plan that will be implemented full sail. It's a plan that would be referred to when there is resurfacing, so you would see this map implemented over many years to come in the future. But anything, Carol or Carmel, to add to what we discussed?
Yeah, I would just say that the map on page 14, which gives the recommended streets that were recommended by the group that put this plan together, were not the streets that the subcommittee recommended.
Right.
For example, we did not agree that Grove Street should be a street where there'd be bicycles. That's something I think we all three of us agreed. So as a trial, we thought if there was any plan to do any work on the streets that are mentioned, Park Street, Bellevue Avenue, Llewellyn Road, mentioned in item 4, if there are plans to do work on those streets, then they should be considered for some kind of bicycle improvement. Now, we didn't go into what that community outreach effort would be, but this document is, it's ready to be edited. We can add that if there's any, push by this group for having this included. We can go through and we can edit the document. It doesn't have to be as you see it here.
I'd like some clarification from Art, perhaps, with regard to Tony's question. If our board would not identify a street and say that this street was going to be eliminate parking, I presume it would have to come from the council, he would have to do something like that. Would that be correct? And then it would have to notify a street that was named for such a thing, that it was on the agenda, so that they could have a chance to respond? Would that be required?
I don't know that the township has to give notice to any particular street if they're going to curving in or anything
Not
like
curbing,
that.
excuse me.
And that
I
is
said
the
if you were
problem.
going to say that the street was no longer going to allow parking, it was going to be a bike lane instead.
So-
You have to notify that street.
That would be an ordinance. Remember, every time they change parking requirements,
Yes, right.
it's an ordinance.
That was my question.
That gets to Tony's, right.
They could, but they have to.
Formal notice.
But we could build that procedure into the plan. It's not there
I was
if
just
there's,
asking.
yeah,
Well,
yeah.
I was not quite sure what Mark's answer was. That's what was from the public. Did you say yes, that they would have to be noticed or notified, or no?
No.
How's the ordinance?
Ordinance.
in
Yeah.
that fashion,
Yeah.
there would be notice.
Yes, yeah.
But
But just a
if you were
general
amend-
notice,
if,
yeah.
no. But if you were
It could
amending,
happen to a street without them having to say it.
That they lose parking,
yes,
not street
that's
parking.
within the purview of the governing body to do that.
Right, but if this is passed as a policy directive, then somebody can come before the governing body and say, hey, here's the policy for all these streets. This is what you're supposed to do if this street is a particular one in the litany of options. And then what's called for as part of that as a policy directive is to remove parking, stripe the street. So we are setting up effectively a mechanism and a process which staff down the road can then take and start to implement, just like when we pass a Belgian block, the council doesn't get into every street that gets then Belgian block in what schedule. It takes on a life of its own because they passed an ordinance saying we're going to Belgian block and spend a certain amount of money. So the council acts in a macro manner, and then staff and town management begins to implement based on the in this case the report with the directives within the report. So if Carol is finished, I want to take a step back. Do you want to?
So I just wanted to get clarification, because that is a concern, that if we were to identify streets on the list and say that if the mandates, the recommendations in this particular plan call for, then the person who lives on that street needs control.
They would only get the note, unless, and I heard Daniel to say this is not contemplated to be a change to the master plan, in which case notice would be required. But this is you're going to give the governing body some kind of recommendation, I guess, is really what it boils down to, in the form of a policy.
Well, no, so this was our recommendation to the planning board in looking at this document, but this document is not positioned, like Janice, you clarified that for us in subcommittee.
What I'm trying to say, even if you adopt it as an addendum to the circulation plan, you're still adopting it as part of the master plan. Okay?
Whether it's addendum or otherwise.
Whether it's an
right?
addendum or a separate element. So it still would be adopted after you finish your amendments. But by adopting it, you're not tying anybody's hands to certain improvements to a certain street. The intent is for it to be flexible and process-driven. And I think that's what the subcommittee was talking about. What's really important is that as the identified streets are improved, that there's outreach to the community to determine what is the best option to make the best complete streets option for those different segments of the road.
And
So-
again, and again, this is in the context of not wanting bikes to use sidewalks, and there not being a lot of safe space for bikes in the town right now. So clearly, the options laid out here would increase safety for bikes. And of course, with the context that the roads are already to be shared with bikes today. But it is safer if you were to add striping or these other features. So, yeah.
So could I just get some clarification? What does the subcommittee contemplate for how people in various neighborhoods? I see there are 5 streets that are contemplated here. What is the contemplation of the subcommittee as to how they would get notice of them being affected?
It's a good question.
I think that is an inherent-
Yeah, we don't really know how that
Yeah.
operates in the
Open
And
town.
we did
as a
not-
possibility without having a strategy that secures the safety of the interests of people who live on various parts of the town. That it seems a little aggressive to put that in place until we have a way to have a recommendation for that.
And we got into line editing the document fairly extensively, and then we recognized that it's better for us to discuss as a planning board if it's even worth our time to line edit this document. Because if we come here and everyone says absolutely not,
Right.
cold stop, we don't want to even talk about this, then it's not really worth us spending more hours.
But the process for community outreach could be built into the document if that's what we wanted to do, if there was
Right.
a push to have this adopted, so.
It could, and I'd like to deal with the elephant in the room now, since this has now gone around.
I just have one other question. Has the township engineer, the past engineer, or the present engineer had the chance to look at this?
Well, the past engineer was
part of the committee.
Was part of the committee and the driving force for this plan.
Yes.
The new township engineer has been copied on these discussions, but he hasn't been he hasn't offered any
An
comments to
opinion or
me.
anything? Okay.
I think we don't want to go any further until we know what the consensus
point.
of the
Sure.
planning board is.
Yep.
Yeah.
So, I think this is an excellent report, extremely well-written, but I believe the underlying policy premise here is off, and that is biking. As beneficial as biking is on many levels, I don't believe that it should be given equal status and parity here with our streets for future transportation planning with autos and pedestrians. And that, I believe, is the underlying intent from the report, although it's not being said directly. And the reason I feel this, as much as I support biking, and think it should be made safer, and recognize its health benefits for the community, is that we essentially live in a bedroom commuter community township where most people use their cars for work, move their kids around, they go to shopping at stores, and they're not taking their bikes to do that. And we have cold winters here. We're not moderate climates like Portland, Oregon, or San Francisco, California, where I think implementing these recommendations in full make a lot of sense. We're not even Princeton, where there's like a huge college town population of young people that are biking around in all weather. Our college community is a couple miles out of town, and they largely drive in to go to bars or to use the services here. So while I think we have a motivated and moderate-sized biking population here, there's really no reported statistic in the report for how large that group is and how much a part of the 39,000 residents want more biking to fully calculate the need and demand to substantiate the kind of taxpayer investment that is called for or would be called for if indeed we implemented fully this complete streets report, which again is extremely well thought through and written. So as technically proficient as the report is, I just don't see it quantified and qualified to substantiate the amount of modification on the streets for bike striping that's being called for. On some streets, some core key arteries to promote more north-south and east-west access, yes, indeed, where they make sense and there's sufficient space to do that, and parking is not being implemented, I think that's a good idea. But in totality, as you see in the report, and I've thought about this a lot, because I remember our former mayor was a big advocate for turning us into Portland, Oregon, and I always believed that was not Mayor Freed, that was not the way to go. So I dispute the underlying premise here, and then consequently end up disputing the premise of equitable communities, which was used within the report to promote that somehow if we make bike lanes available everywhere, that people who are in a lower socioeconomic strata will then bike more and end up using biking more because it's cheaper than cars. I think there's been absolutely no data to support that. If indeed there was that, we'd be seeing a demand for that over the past 20 years, and we haven't. This is essentially a lobbying effort by a group that wants more bike riding here and more bike safety, and that's all good and fine, but it is a special interest group, and compared to the overall needs of the township and taxpayer expenditures, I do not see the full, complete report, as the way to go. That's pretty much it.
Well, to some extent, it relates to one of my concerns, and that is that the number of streets in this town that are less than 37 feet wide is a pretty significant number. And the plan really does focus on not just sharing those roads, but reserving the streets for that population of bikes. And it would take at least 1/3 of the width of the street to, for example, Upper Mountain Avenue is 32 feet wide, and with 12 feet dedicated to bike lanes, you don't leave much else. And in fact, the plan talks about better policing to be sure that nobody parks. So it opens a Pandora's box in terms of the extent to which the plan introduces the idea of enforcing what may be an increase of bike lanes, for which there is not sufficient demand. Now, I do think that there is a need for better bike safety, and I certainly support that, but I'm wondering about the documentation to support the ratio of dedicated biking to the needs of the town in general. I would like to see more documentation as to the extent to which biking is needed or supported. I would like to see, because the group that is been surveyed so far is relatively small. I think one of the things that we might want to recommend is getting an increased input as to exactly how many biking lanes are actually needed and where they should be.
But we agree that bikes share the road now, right?
That's what I'm saying. I'm saying they share the road now. And we are, to the extent that we do road shadows and that we've kind of universally, at least the subcommittee agreed with a very good idea to make biking more comfortably road shared. But the idea of dedicating and restricting one-third
There's no
of the
roads
street,
worth
right.
restricting to bikes only. I
Well,
mean, if
not
you shut
only-
down half of the roads, then I would agree. That's complete equal equity. There's roads that are only for cars, roads that are only for bikes. The whole town is access to bikes, access to cars. And
Okay,
right
I
now,
think
it's
you
not safe for the
misunderstood me.
bikes in many
I think you
areas.
misunderstood me. I did not say that that there's one road even one road in the report that is said to be, should be just bikes. What I'm saying is that if we say that we want bike lanes that are in fact separated from and exclusively to be used by bikes, that we should not have parking on that street instead, and that these lanes would be, well, as I said, exclusively used by bikes. That would say that they're being used 24 hours a day, 365 days a year, that only bicycles could use that space on the road. And I don't think we have documented that we have that much need for bikes.
We're
that they be
implicitly
used equitably.
sorry. But we're implicitly asserting that the roads are just for cars because it's too dangerous for bikes right now, right?
No, I wouldn't say that they're too dangerous for bikes right now, not in general. I would say that there needs to be more bike safety, but I wouldn't say that bikes are not allowed. There are bikes on the road still, but the question is how much of the road should be dedicated just for bikes as bike lanes? That's the question. I'm not saying there should be no place in town where there's a bike lane, but I am saying that the document seems to be supporting a lot of dedicated space that is exclusively for bikes year-round. We have winter climate here. When it snows, the roads are narrower. What happens to the bike lane when there's snow on the ground? If we put in the divisors and dividing barriers between the bike and the cars, when you push snow against the barrier, what's left? Who's going to clean, what's the safety issues involved in that space and maintaining it? So there are some complex issues, and I don't think that we have dealt with those issues at this point.
For instance, I support a north-south bike lane here, but Upper Mountain Grove is not, given the size of those streets, does not seem like the place to do it. A place like Midland, where there is less car traffic through car traffic and it's wider, makes much more sense if you're going to create a north-south bike path, which I've always said. So I just think, I take, like Carol, take issue with some of the fundamental principles within the report and agree that there hasn't been enough statistical and evaluative review of what people could or should do or the demand. And today, the major problem that I know the council still hears and we hear is parking. It's not a lack of bike options. It's still not enough parking everywhere, and having to move cars or whatever. So I just think, again, the report is extremely well written. There's some good things to do in there, but as a totality, it should not be attached to the master plan. It should be reviewed as part of future transportation needs by our experts, and not be considered a policy directive, but instead a policy option or policy options for staff and council to consider going forward.
And Carol, sorry, I did misspeak. I wasn't assuming that you were saying to shut down any of the roads. You were saying there's dedicated space on the road only for bike lanes.
Mm-hmm.
As I understand it, there's nowhere in this document that they're recommending these changes impede the flow of current traffic. So it's not that these lanes are dedicated, like there's no portions where they're recommending the street be dedicated for bikes only with no vehicular access.
I think what Ms. Willis is trying to say is that, it's, you mentioned Upper Mountain, and you're familiar with Upper Mountain.
Yes.
It's one lane in each direction, and then there's a shoulder on each side for parking.
One
and
side for parking.
One side.
Oh, it's only, okay, one side for
Right.
Well, it
parking.
depends
Not wide
on-
enough to
although-
have a shoulder on
Although
both sides
landscape
for
trucks
parking.
like to park on both sides, but
Yeah.
we'll leave that for another discussion. So I think one of the recommendations in the report is if you took a street like that, you took away that shoulder for parking and made that a bike lane only, no parking. I think that's what Ms. Willis is
correct.
trying
That's
to raise a concern about. Not
But-
that we're taking those 2 lanes of car travel away, but the plan would consider taking away 1 lane of parking and replace it with a bike-only lane. And it could be divided by just a white stripe down the road, or it could be divided by, some sort of median, bricks
Yeah.
or what have you.
And in sequence, I was thinking of this first for pedestrians, which, correct me if I'm wrong, but I think we agree largely with the direction of the report in terms of, improving pedestrian access. And then in terms of bikes, I was just saying the improvements that have no impact on parking whatsoever, can we at least include those? And those, as I understand it, would not impede the flow of traffic or parking. And it's really segmenting what is now shared space to say cars go in these lanes for bikes. I do admit, though, it's a very small fraction of the town that can be addressed without affecting parking.
Well, the streets that you've recommended, I would assume they all have parking, Willowdale, Elm, Llewellyn, Bellevue,
So
Park Street.
even with those, we were saying to prioritize them, but still we need a process and plan so that, again, there would not be impact to parking. And again, in my view, it's really, can we make any progress on this at all? So even if we say no effects to parking, Sharrows only, the pedestrian aspect of this report, let's at least say what we do support versus wholesale saying there's nothing in here that can go forward. But
Okay.
But I also think it needs to be very clear that we're recommending this as potential options for future transportation planning and not as a wholesale report to be used, because what will occur as inevitably, 5 years down the line, somebody's going to take this report and say, hey, planning board passed this. This is what they support. Let's implement this. Without a doubt, someone will try to do that. That's why I think it needs to be deconstructed as potential options for future transportation planning that either the town engineer with the council or the town engineer with Public Works consider. So that's why I'm focusing on deconstructing this.
that does make sense. And you see, right now when we look out in terms of striping, Janice, how much is it in town now? To me, it's negligible, but what do
How
we
much is
currently have for dedicated bike lanes?
We have none.
There's not even, I thought there was one
Union.
block over by,
Union Street.
Union has a painted bicycle.
Oh, okay, I mean, I know we've got Sharrows.
Oh, sure, yes.
Okay, we have Sharrows on Glen Ridge, and maybe we have Sharrows on Union, but we don't have any, to my knowledge, any dedicated bike lanes. We just have Sharrows.
So maybe that's helpful just to think about, is that where we want to be? Or would we want to see more dedicated striping? And if the answer is we would like this to continue for another 20, 30 years, then that would be helpful for me to understand. Because again, I'm trying to understand what gains we can make, but I look outside and it's not like we've made a lot of gains. Even though this was and I was looking back at the 2016, and then back in 06, there was also the circulation element is out of date. It should be updated. So that must have come from years before 06. So it's been a while.
It's a lot of the comments that I'm hearing tonight seem to be the same comments that this body brought up when this report was first released.
Right.
And did we take any action, Janice, do you remember,
No.
as a board on this? We just accepted it as?
You said that you didn't feel comfortable adopting it in its present form, and at that point, we didn't have a budget to do some wholesale rewriting. Now, if it's a matter of just taking out sections that you don't agree with, we might be able to work with the consultant who prepared this to take out those sections and make it into something that the board can approve. So if it's a matter of, practically speaking, is there any place in the township where we can have a full dedicated bike lane? Maybe not. So maybe we'll just take that option off of every single typology. Then maybe we do it on I don't know. But the subcommittee, I think, the way I heard you talking is that you're willing to take the time to edit the plan so that it's something that the board can adopt.
Perhaps
Because I think there's a lot of
dramatically.
good in here. If you look at the this really calls for bump outs. There's a lot of pedestrian improvements in here. So there's a lot of really good concepts in here. So if we can cut out the things that you say absolutely no way, or if it's Midland Avenue is the only place that you think that we can do a dedicated bike lane,
I'm sure we could find other streets that are wide enough
Sure.
that significant parking would not be mitigated, with a review. But the way this was set up as a typology, it's imposing, as Carol said, on streets that just aren't wide enough, it's going to directly impact the use of cars there and the parking of cars. So I think with some careful review
right?
and staff review, we could find north, south, and east-west streets that might fit the bill.
Is Grove is Grove a county? So and
So
is
is
Valley as well?
Valley is county.
So in the middle you've got Midland, but on the south end of Midland you've got the high school, and they've got very little parking. So if you take part of that out, now you've got a hardship there. They already have an issue with parking, so now you've really impeded that.
But Tim, the flip side is, shouldn't we provide bike access to the high school? Isn't that one of the places?
Talk to
that
the
we-
teachers.
So maybe you start the bike lane 3 blocks up.
Right, exactly,
yeah,
exactly.
Let me ask you, sorry, Cook, maybe you know this. Is there a speed limit for bicycles, or do they have to adhere to vehicle speed limits? Do you know?
It's hard to go 25 miles an hour.
You can have electric bikes. People have those electric bikes now.
Electric bike, electric bikes, yeah. Electric bikes
Pedestrian
too?
bike, there's no real huge speed limit.
No,
But
no
you are
speed
to
limit.
adhere to the road signs on the street. So if there's a stop sign, you need to stop.
Sure, yeah,
You
yeah,
know, so there are things like that they
Right.
have to, adhere to.
right. But there's no speed limit per se?
Not that I'm
but- Okay. I was
fully
just
aware
curious.
of, yeah.
Okay.
Grove is a good example, because it was actually a controversial call. The county did not want to implement a bike lane on Grove, but they were convinced by the township to do so. And the premise behind it, and correct me if I'm wrong, Janice, please here, was that it would provide traffic calming, that somehow putting a bike lane there would provide traffic calming and slow traffic down. And there's been some statistics saying that the traffic has slowed, but
Well,
it's still it's
what
a
we did
dangerous
with-
street with trucks
What we
there.
did with Grove Street is we made the lanes narrower.
Right.
And following those lane restripings, Kim crafted some studies and traffic was slower. The reason I understand because this was prior to my involvement with the township, I understand the reason they decided not to proceed with any bike lanes on Grove Street is because the community, the people who lived along Grove Street didn't support it because it would affect their parking.
Right.
And pulling
That's what I
pulling
heard.
out of their driveways.
Right. So,
And there were some issues with accidents.
I mean,
Yes.
I think the county's willing to work with the township.
I think professionals need to evaluate on a street-by-street basis where some of these well-thought-through recommendations make sense and not in the typology, the overarching typology that was in the report. Some of these elements can be and perhaps should be on some streets. And I'm throwing Midland out because it seems logically a wide street without through traffic that potentially a bike lane could be put there. But, there are clearly problems with that. And I'm not a transportation planner. I'm saying somebody who's got a lot more chops in this area than everybody sitting around here needs to sit down with this and say, yeah, we could do this here, we could do that there, we shouldn't do it here. People who know.
That's why I asked about the engineer.
Well, and that brings up a good question. So back when this first was drafted, we didn't have money for revisions. Do we have money for revisions now?
I have some, not a lot.
Okay.
Yeah. So that's why I said, if it's a matter of editing this document and taking out things that you don't feel comfortable, that we could do that. But if it's doing additional research and evaluation, I don't think that we don't have a budget.
I think we start
for
with
it.
and remove from it, though, right?
Yeah.
We have the option of recommending whichever way we'd like,
So
but
candidly, the subcommittee was hoping that the first two, we could all be on the same page with. One, the pedestrian aspect of this.
That's the strength, it's more
And se-
possibility in terms of being practical.
Yes.
I'd also like to say, sometimes I think that pedestrian safety is harmed when you have bikes. I know people in New York City, the pedestrians are always complaining about the bikes not following the rules and getting hit by bikes. It happens all the time. Not all the time, but it happens frequently enough for it to be of a concern. So I'm not too sure the two things go hand in hand, pedestrian safety and the use of bike lanes.
Well, the second, I
Just
just think
throwing
the
that out there.
sharrows. So yeah, just the pedestrian improvements and then the sharrows. And then 3 and 4, I think we can do away with and say that we'll line edit the current document with, expert
Crack at
input to
that.
that.
well, should we, before you go through line editing, and trust me, I love line editing. You know that. Everybody on this
join
board
the
knows that.
Yes,
Well, the engineer first, though, right?
Yeah. Engineer first, copy editor second. Would it be a better use of time and more efficient for the subcommittee to kind of bring up some of maybe the big ideas, like cut this section, cut that section, rather than a line by line? Just to, I'd hate to see you
Yeah, we could
spend
do that,
a
right.
lot of time line editing and.
Right. Honestly, maybe Montclair is not the town for bike lanes, honestly. It could be.
Could be some
Yeah.
bike lanes.
Yeah.
Some.
Mm-hmm.
Why doesn't the subcommittee meet with the town engineer? Or whoever our engineer is with expertise in this area?
Well, I would suggest, we have the board engineer, Mike Dannemiller, was one of the authors of this report, so we could bring him in. Since he was part of this report, he knows Montclair pretty well, he could be part of this conversation and help, direct these changes.
And the best approach to refining it even. Because we were thinking you adjust the upfront map, you take out a lot of the topologies that are mentioned later on, just say we don't want those anywhere.
And the
But maybe,
implementation.
yeah, so that was our simple, naive view on how to greatly reduce it. But an expert would probably tell us there's a better approach
The
to.
implementation section also needs to be significantly added, because if this was just passed and attached to the master plan, someone would say, oh, okay, we've designated these streets, let's go, boom. And then it would become a budgetary issue with the council just moving to pass it. It would take on a life of its own. So the implementation aspect needs to be stopped at this point until an engineer and the board agree on the policy itself.
Great, so is it best if we go ahead and proceed down that path? Maybe this isn't helpful, but if there is consensus from the planning board regarding, so you'd mentioned implementation, community engagement whenever parking is affected, if there's even kind of 3, 4, 5 points we could take down now and then go back as a subcommittee, that would be helpful. Because I know a lot has been said tonight, but it would be great to kind of...
I think if I, summed
Yeah.
up, you didn't hear any issues from the board about pedestrian improvements.
Right.
I would say we're probably all on board with that. I think we're probably all on board with Sharrows, but I have to say, when Clifton put Sharrows in, I had no idea what they were until this report came out, and I learned what a Sharrow was. So there's probably some education that needs to happen. Thank you. So I think you should consider, saying you as a subcommittee,
Right.
consider how communications will work around this plan and this implementation. If things are implemented, how will we communicate with the community, especially folks that are living on streets where there may or may not be a change, or if there is a change, how do we get in touch with them? I think that's what Tony brought up right in the very beginning. I think it's a good point. And then some of these other questions that we have about...
I guess the problem on that is, I think that, and I'll speak very plainly, if you ask people if they want their parking removed, you're going to get 90% no.
Right.
So-
That's exactly
So,
right.
and that was like so then, this is a problem with the plan. So this is a political, I look at you, this is more of a political issue than it is a planning board issue.
But is it
This
really?
is how much does the town want it? And
Yeah.
then there needs to be a champion to do it. And I think that, we'll go through this dance, I think, but I don't have a problem in just putting this up right now, because it has a lot of good ideas. But for me to sit here and try to figure out what's best and what's not, without the data, I don't know which is the best. And so I'm not complaining, I'm just saying, I think it's kind of a difficult, I'm perfectly fine with having you guys take a crack at editing it, but it's pretty good the way it is. It's not really definitive, but that's what's good about it. It gives you a lot of options to look at. It gives you a really good formula to consider. I think the various options in building out the streets are really good if you're going to consider doing it, to know what the various options are. And then you have to figure out if you have the political will to say, okay, this is really important for the town, because the people in the town want this. And you appoint someone, you hire someone, and you do it.
But how do you know
But I
that?
think-
Do you really think the people in town want this? They did a survey.
Well, we don't know.
Well,
I
no,
think
no,
in
they did a
years,
survey,
I think there's more
2,000
people that want it than you think.
Well, they
But-
did a survey, 2,000 surveys went out, 170 people responded.
Right,
So that's nothing.
That's not representative.
That's not the town. So what
That's
makes
the
you think that this?
170 people that look, there's
And half
no
of them
way
probably-
most of the parents with kids in this town are returning that report. And those are the people that would most likely be biking. So again, I don't want to overly scrutinize 170 of 2,000 responding, but I don't think and if anything, it's selecting in the opposite direction of the folks that would typically be biking, in my view. Again, no one really knows, because I would imagine it's anonymous, but,
I think that's an issue that no one really knows, and that's the question.
right.
But people could know. And it may, because given the amount of expenditure required, if we were really implementing this, I'm not talking about just on a couple of streets, if the plan was actually being implemented with the typology, there would be significant public expenditures required. We could do a study, with 500 people to come up with an opinion survey on a lot of these points. It's not unfeasible. People do polls all the time. So that's not an inhibiting factor. I still believe that the underlying issue here needs to be addressed both practically and politically, and that is parity of biking with these other transportation modes. And that to me is the elephant in the room as I saw it.
I happen to agree with you, Martin. I think most people in town walk, not everybody bikes. And if you were going to give me an option of putting money toward either safer pedestrian crossings, more of those flashing crosswalks, I would vote for that. And I'm not saying that bikers don't have the right to ride and shouldn't be safe.
Exactly.
I'm just saying, given a limited budget and where my priority would be, it would be to make sure we don't have any more pedestrian fatalities, which seem to be all too common.
I think you guys have a good idea of where to go, and, it'd be great to get a few hours of our professionals to weigh in on this. I would like to give a couple minutes to members of the public who would like to speak about this. If you would. If you wouldn't, then
I would, I wasn't expecting to, but.
Yeah.
Okay.
You have to come up to the microphone. I know it's.
Sorry,
take your time. And if you could, give us your name and affiliation, if any, for the record.
hang on a second.
My name is Deborah Kagan. I'm president of Bike and Walk Montclair. I live at 66 Beverly Road and have been there for 30 years. So there's a lot that I could run to, but I'm going to take just a couple of things. So it's our understanding that the document is not prescriptive, right? That it is options. And that it was designed that way on purpose so that the town engineer, the public at large, the town council could go through the process of determining what was the best for particular streets. And that this was designed as a resource. This was funded with DOT, New Jersey DOT funding, and I think that there is an expectation, if we want to go back to them for other funding for any kind of infrastructure and programs, that they'd like to see what we do with this report that they have funded, number one. The issue about policy as a basic question about whether it should be in the master plan. So we have policy currently on the books. We have a complete streets policy. It does say that the streets should be used multimodal, which means pedestrians, bicyclists, and cars, and all ages and all disabilities should have equal access. That's a current policy that we have. And so this document was, in fact, to try to get us closer to actual implementation. There is not a particular implementation plan, and I've read it twice, the whole thing, including all the amendments. It has suggestions and it has summaries from an existing, there's a whole lot of existing reports that have been done. There isn't one that says you have to take this street and put a striped bike lane or a protected bike lane on it. And the topographies are just to give us an idea of the options based on the type of street, arterial, main arterial, and the size, right? So that's what the topologies are about for that. I went and looked at some of the statistics in our area, besides just in Montclair, because this question about biking and the weather and our Portland has come up before when we had the last presentation. So I just want to say, as an example, there's a lot of data from something like New York City, where having bike lanes has in fact cut down on traffic crashes about 50%. And I've read some of the data. I can help you find that if we need that. That's true across the country. Most of the data I know is from larger cities, and that was brought up, I know, we're not a major city. So it turns out that the Voorhees department at the Bike and Pedestrian Center, they have a lot of data and they've done a lot of studies. They recently did a study, case study from Passaic County, all of the municipalities in Passaic County. And that report is public, and you guys can all take a look at it. I read through it on the last. And one of the things that it said is that in 2012, they had 0 bike lanes, dedicated bike lanes. They now have over 100 miles of dedicated bike lanes in Passaic County. So it's not Portland, it's Passaic. And it's the same weather we have, and it's similar municipalities that we have here. They found that both for safety issues and as they built more bike lanes, that there was a definite increase in usage. So there's a relationship also in terms of leadership in the town to providing safe biking lanes in our streets and usage. So it's true, it's good to find out how many people are using biking in the streets now, but there's, across the country, it is clear, once there are increased safety for bicyclists in streets, there is an increase in usage. And there is a relationship between that usage and crashes, and pedestrian crashes. In Wayne, which is also right in our neighborhood, there was in one large corridor that they put bike lanes in, and they reduced traffic crashes by 50%.
I'm sorry, you crashed.
This is all crashes. This is all crashes, yeah. They did a yeah, it's in Wayne, I can give you the details. It's in a report that was done by Voorhees. And they did they combined a road diet, meaning they narrowed the lanes, with a bike lane and some pedestrian crossing structure, and they reduced the crashes by 50% on that quarter between 2012 and today. So the point is that there's a relationship also to understand between bike lanes, road diets, pedestrian safety, that sometimes I'm not hearing as part of our conversation, that complete streets is not just about, oh, there's some people that want to bike and we should make it safe, which we should, but there's also a whole relationship about the transportation aspect of having all users be considered, and that includes bike lanes and pedestrians and cars. So I think that we have to have a more holistic approach, and that's why we had a complete streets policy in the first place, and that this document was really to help us as a resource, not to restrict us that we have to have a bike lane. For instance, if the town decides, and the town council and the outreach process decide that it's not a good place to put it on Upper Mountain, and I've ridden my bike on Upper Mountain, it's hard, okay, then that doesn't, there's nothing in this report or incorporating it into the master plan that would require the town to do that and to spend capital funds on that. So I think that we have to look at what the purpose of this particular report was and how we could best use it, and not incorporating it and not including bike safety, bike lanes, and the use of the streets for all users, including bicyclists, is not inconsistent with our current complete streets policy. And it's not in consistency with the circulation and land use report from 2017, which calls for a network. It says there is a need for a network for pedestrian and cycling in our town. And it goes through a report on what people said about what we needed. That's in the 2017 report. So all of these things point to we need some guidance and some more resources to help us implement, and that is what I think this report was trying to do. So I'll leave it at that at the moment.
I do want to
Yeah.
comment to that, because I think you made some very good points, but I also want to respond by saying I think that this board was a bit negligent in our passage of language of the prior Complete Streets effort, which came under another administration. I don't think we spent enough attention and time to address that, but essentially pro forma passed it on because it was in other reports, and we did not review it at the time. So I think what you've brought up here is that we actually do need to spend a good bit of more energy thinking this through. And some of the points you made are valid and should be considered, and I think the subcommittee working with the engineer is the way to do that. I do dispute one thing you're saying, and that is this, because I know how government and policy works. The way this report is written, and in the implementation section, if this was passed and put into the master plan, it would inevitably become part of a policy directive, and it effectively directs policymakers to act right now. It says to implement the Complete Streets policy into the administrative operations of Montclair. The policy should be deployed strategically in a way that is comprehensive and systematic, operating consistently within the normal course of business and affecting all aspects of transportation planning, design, maintenance, and operation. That's on page 33. And it goes on to be just as specific. One way to approach this is by making use of a series of Complete Streets checklists similar to those within Essex County Complete Streets Implementation Plan, et cetera, et cetera. If this went in as is, inevitably would be used as a policy directive to implement, and control would be lost from whether we want to do this or not or don't. So this is the moment to really evaluate what of this report we as a board think should be passed on as a recommendation to the council. And I think the manner we set up here, and that is the subcommittee review this with an engineer and come back and we kick this around some more, is the way to go. There's a lot of good stuff in here. I don't want you to take both Carol and my concerns incorrectly. There's a lot of good ideas, suggestions, and directives here. It just, as the way this is written as a comprehensive initiative, it would take on a life of its own and just roll out, and then there would be a demand for public expenditures coming down the road, and someone would hold us up and say, hey, the planning board passed this. Well, this is our policy, as you just said. So this is the time to take a step back and reflect on how much this should be addressed and how we want to address a 21st century transportation network here.
Can I just say just a slight comment? So we were the first town to do the Complete Streets in 2019. I'm not going to comment on who the administration was. We're way past that.
Sure.
Since then, 134 towns have adopted Complete Streets. So we were just on the beginning edge, and this is the trend that's happening. Obviously, all these municipalities think this is an important direction, as does Essex County, as does the state, as does most of the country, and major cities are going in this direction. And it's for a reason. It has cut down on pedestrian and car crashes. It has allowed people to have active transportation for health, for culture, for livable cities, for the economy. There's a whole bunch of reasons. They're well documented, and the summaries are in that document as well. I'm just saying that even in the current Complete Streets policy, it requires anything that has a 20% capital funding to go through the process of the town council. And that's the policy now. So this does not open it up, I think, for an unlimited funding, like, okay, we're going to put in all this. It still has to go through the town council, and whatever is determined as to the process for outreach, which, by the way, we support, that I think there needs to be outreach to the town. There needs to be support from the town. How that happens and how you look at that support is a little more complicated. If you're providing leadership and future planning for a town, you don't want to limit yourself to just the opinion of the people on one street, right? We're talking about network for the whole town. Given that, you don't want to alienate people, and people have a right, obviously, to participate in this process. So I think the idea of coming up with a reasonable process for the outreach is a really important part of this. Whether or not you have to do that before this is adopted into the master plan, I'm not sure. I think it could be adopted into the master plan, and then the question about the process for how that outreach and how that decision-making is a separate issue and should be addressed separately.
And
Thank
just
you.
one, yep, just one other comment to what you had said there. And thank you for mentioning, so it was 2011, the severe and fatal incidents in New York City per 10 million were in fact 40.1 and did go in 2017 down to 20.4. So just like you had mentioned, they have, the only added piece of context is that the trips, total cycling trips in million in 2011 were 98.6 and went all the way up to 178.8. So the trips nearly double, and the events per 10 million almost half. So
Right. That's
it's really
and they have a
dramatic.
they have the Vision Zero policy, which is an additional part to their policy program for the crashes. But yeah,
Right.
and it's not just New York City. I mean,
Yeah,
it's across the country.
I'd be interested in the statistics you cited for
Sure.
Wayne and Passaic County, please.
I have
If you can email them to me. I don't know.
And
Be
what
happy to.
street in Wayne is that?
Yeah, well, hopefully
Yeah.
your
Do
statistics
You want me to
would
go look? I
show-
have it written down.
Well,
Maybe you can-
hopefully what you,
I have it.
Oh, okay.
I have it.
I mean, it could be a park, it could be, where have they,
Okay. It's Valley Road in Wayne Township, when a resurfacing project turned road diet, addition of a bike lane, clearly delineated pedestrian crossings. According to county data, since this project's completion in 2012, crashes along the road having been cut in half, with dangerous crashes having been reduced by more than 60%.
I know Valley Road well.
Okay? And a really good source if you, sorry, if,
Want more statistics?
Is the light on? Just press the button.
yep, there we go, is the Voorhees Bicycle and Pedestrian Center at Rutgers. They have a case study that I was referring to on Passaic County. Passaic County has been very, very active as a county in working with all its municipalities. I think more so even than Essex. And it's an interesting model also for procedure and how they've worked with municipalities to help them make these decisions. And it's something that we could use as a resource. sort
so
of
what
in
do I
terms
look,
of-
what do I
of
look up?
Procedure. I'm sorry?
What do I look up to get this information that you're talking about?
The Rutgers has a
I think it's Rutgers
Voorhees,
Voorhees.
yeah.
Voorhees Center.
Yep.
Yep.
Is the Bike and Pedestrian Center.
Mhm.
It's the New Jersey Department of Transportation does data work with them. They work directly with the center.
So you got this information on their website?
Online, it's online, it's
Okay,
public.
that's what I'm
Yeah.
asking.
And
Yeah,
I
it's
think
public
if you
online.
probably have more questions, but sure, Bike and Walk Montclair would be happy to provide
Yeah.
input to the
Yeah, I'm happy to
subcommittee.
That
talk
was
about
part
this
of-
at any time.
That was one of the things that we said at our, when you
Yeah.
presented 2 years ago, was that we needed more data, and I don't
Yeah.
think anything was given to us to give us this data on
What I'll do
safety.
is I'll work with Deborah to get the data.
I have
and I will circulate it to everybody on the planning board.
I asked James Sinclair for data. He gave me a bunch. Some of it's older, some of it's new. But what was really interesting wasn't just, it's a lot of cities, but it's not just the cities. So they are starting to get data now from counties in New Jersey that have a similar municipality makeup that we do.
And maybe that's exactly what we need to feel more comfortable about
Yeah.
what's
I'm
presented
happy to
us,
work with,
so.
with Janice or Carmelo, whoever.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you very much for letting me speak.
Thank you.
Okay, I think
You want
subcommittee knows what.
Oh, my sticks. Yeah, did you see that? I'm improving that.
This will be brief.
Very brief, I promise. The Pedestrian Safety Advisory Committee, Alex Cantha, did a letter also of support for the plan in general. I have a copy. I'd just like to present it to someone. That's all.
Give it to
So you
Ms.
guys have
Talley.
copies of
Give
it.
it to Ms. Talley. And
Okay.
she can circulate it to the subcommittee.
Should she read it into the record?
Do you want me to read it into the record?
No?
I don't think so.
Okay.
Because you guys are about to go through and cross out and strike a lot of things in the plan. I think there's probably a better time for a lot more public input when we get closer to, say, passing something or reckoning. Or not, I mean, however this board decides to, but I think
long when I go
tonight's
for
probably not the right time. But thank you for the comments, and I think there's some really good ideas here. Next up, we have a report from the Personnel Subcommittee on a revised proposal from BD Padovano.
Right. The proposal provided by BD Padovano in November had a typo, so that the budget allocated and the budget approved by the planning board was less than the previous year. So we finally got a revised proposal. There's sufficient funds in our budget to pay for the revised proposal. In fact, I got a certification of funds from the CFO today. Okay, so what I need is a new resolution from the board with the new proposal and the new amount. I think it's the retainer is $2,500 a quarter. It's $10,000 a year, plus $450 per meeting, which is why we only pay for one attorney at a meeting, and then the hourly rate for applications.
So how is that different than what we approved?
It was $200 a quarter,
Oh.
or $500 a quarter.
500. The two fell off somehow.
Oh, somehow,
Yeah.
okay.
Yeah.
Well, I move approval.
Motion by Ms. Willis, second by Mr. Schwartz. All in favor?
Aye.
Opposed? Abstentions?
Thank you all.
Okay.
Okay. Next up, we have bills.
And I know, Keith, you had a question about one of the bills,
It was a very minor question,
and
but
it's
yes.
only because I didn't want to put that cost in two separate lines.
Okay.
Because the bills were dated the same day, so it's not an issue.
Okay, I just, for tracking purposes and just so everybody here, there were two invoices that got combined in the line on the balance sheet.
I just combined two invoices into one line item on the balance
As long
sheet.
as it doesn't screw up your records, I would, and as long as nobody else has any other bills, comments, great. I would move to approve the bills.
All in favor?
Aye.
Opposed? Abstentions? Okay, so our next meeting is a week from today, which is why I gave everybody's packets for tonight.
So I
Okay?
have a question for you, though. So that's the same draft 4 that we were given last go-round? I meant
No, that's the one that was,
circulated, that
that was the
doesn't
one
have...
that was circulated after the last meeting.
Yes, it does, but if anybody gave any comments or changes, they're not included.
They're not. I noticed there was one that I
Yeah,
had.
so are we getting a draft 5
That's
that would
the la-
include
that's-
people's changes?
No, that's the one that I got from Dennis.
So the
Well, then
idea
I've
is
got to go
that
back and do it
at the
again.
next meeting, we'll go through that
Right.
line by line or whatever and give our comments verbally. Is that
Well,
correct?
is there a way that we could ask Mr. Galvin to send us a new revision?
That's it. The way Dennis,
What he's saying
He
is he had
hears-
to make the other one.
well, he's the editor. So
Right.
you send comments to him, everybody sent comments to, some of your comments will be incorporated, some will not be.
So,
And he's the only one who knows, what he's heard from you.
I understand, because we're sending his comments, so the.
And so some of them make sense and some
But-
of them he doesn't agree with, so.
But here's what I'm asking. So this is dated April 17th, and it sounds like what I'm hearing from our board members is that they've provided comments since April 17th.
Oh.
So what I'm wondering is.
Oh, I didn't know that.
yes,
That's what
subsequent.
I fully understand your point,
Right.
Janice, that not everything will be
You
included,
know what,
but
then I will reach out to him tomorrow and
Right.
find out if he's.
I mean, am I the only one? Did anybody else send comments on the April 17th draft?
Well, if he conceptually disagrees with what you submitted, then we should work it out.
Well, I
here.
Right.
spoke directly to him, and he said he agreed it's not in here, so I.
Right, well,
Well,
there you go.
that's-
So there's an edit here.
So that's I think the question. If you can find out from Mr. Galvin
Yeah.
if he'd be able to, even if he doesn't agree with comments he's received, let us know, is this the actual version we should now look at, or will
Right.
there be an update in the next day or so
Okay.
that we can review?
Okay.
Red line? Did I get a red line?
Yeah.
We did get a red line.
There's a red
I mean,
line.
that's a thought. Why doesn't
it's
he give another
non-specific.
red line with the comments that people have given? Because quite frankly, I don't think there are all that many, given that this would be the 5th draft that we're looking at.
I think it's not going to say who provided the comment.
Well, it
but
could.
it's-
He could.
He'd
There's
have
certain
a-
reasons not to do
Yeah,
that.
yeah.
And so I think it's just going to be a blanket red line.
That's fine, too. Just as long,
Yep.
it's much easier to look at a red line, obviously, than going through
agree.
it line by line, which quite frankly is what I have done, so.
I agree. So, yeah, if you can let us know, Ms. Talley,
Okay.
what he says, that'd be great.
So clearly, since Carol mentioned she had submitted some edits that Mr. Galvin agreed with, but hadn't been reflected, there's a delay in drafting. Carmel may have submitted some edits that he didn't disagree with, in which case, where there's a conceptual disagreement, we'll address those at the meeting itself.
And I also suspect if you have comments on either this version or a new version we get in the next day or two, I don't know if Mr. Galvin's going to have time to incorporate those, or if those will be put on the record at the next meeting.
I sent mine in a long time ago, so
Understood?
they're in there.
Okay. And then I will also find out what's going on with 37 Orange Road. Evidently, they're coming back.
That's the other application, or
That's
the other
only
item
one
that's
we have-
on?
The only one we have on for that night.
Okay,
Okay?
great.
All
See
right.
you all next week.
So Dennis is going to be here next week.
Dennis will be here.
Dennis will be here next week, and he's going to end up then having to deal with that particular application,
Right.
right?
Right.
Which-
It actually makes sense
Which
to
Mr.
have
Neese
them-
is conflicted anyways.
Yeah, together.
Oh,
He's got a conflict.
Mr. Neese is conflicted on 37 Orange, so Mr. Galvin will represent us anyways.
Okay.
Good.
Great. See you next week, except you.